Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining me and the Western Front Association tonight for my talk. It's a two-part talk. I'm going to be talking about the build up to the war in the Middle East and the first sort of couple of phases of the war, how it panned out, and also how it related to other theaters. And then next week, I'll be going on to the end of the campaign. Just as with the Western Front, really, you wouldn't really try and squeeze the whole Western Front into one talk. It's kind of a two-parter. Today, we're going to look at the opening phases, the need to sort of reorganize and counterattack from the initial Ottoman offensives, and to the war in the balance, which leads us up to the capture of Jerusalem. And then next week, Allenby's checkmate from Jerusalem to victory. For anyone who might have been familiar with some of the talks that I did during my work at the National Army Museum, when the centenary period was approaching, it occurred to me there was going to be a lot of emphasis and attention on the Western Front. So I really wanted to do a bit of work around reminding people that there were other theaters in the war and that they weren't just sideshows. They were actually, in many cases, quite significant and quite important in the outcome of the war. So this was a sort of preliminary slide which accompanied all of them. I didn't touch on all of the theaters. I didn't do the Eastern Front because it didn't really involve British Empire forces, but I did do a series of talks highlighting some of the less well-known stories. So the war in the Pacific, the Dardanelles and Gallipoli, Sinai, Palestine, Syria, Mesopotamia, and the Caucasus, and the Italian Front. And this was one of the two talks that I did, a two-part talk to do the Sinai and Palestine campaign. So this is the first part. So the first and most obvious question is, how did Britain come to fight the Middle East? Now, obviously, this audience are probably going to be pretty au fait with the build-up to the war, but I did do a little bit of background, so we won't dwell on it too much. But essentially, following the Napoleonic Wars, the treaty system which established the peace in Europe, the long-lasting peace, rising nationalism and militantism, a sort of growing arms race, and a tangled web of alliances is the situation that we find ourselves in terms of sort of pre-war diplomacy and foreign policy, the international rivalries of big European imperial powers. And that quote there from Otto von Bismarck in 1888 really summarizes: one day the great European war will come out of some damned foolish thing in the Balkans. And he couldn't have been more right. The events of 1914, I'm sure most of you are very familiar with on the Western Front, but just a quick recap to have it fresh in our mind. 28th of June, Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated by Gavrilo Princip, a young Bosnian separatist who objected to the 1908 Austro-Hungarian annexation of Bosnia. And he and his fellow young Bosnians, they believed in the unification of Yugoslavia into a unified state free of Austrian rule or interference. This event, the assassination, triggered weeks of chaos and diplomatic wrangling known as the July Crisis and the Austro-Hungarian ultimatum to Serbia, which set the wheels of those tangled webs of alliance into motion. Britain had originally offered to try and mediate and avoid war, but soon Austria and Serbia had mobilized against each other, and the wheels of those alliances began to turn. So on 28th of July, Austria declared war with Serbia. Russia prepared to defend Serbia. On the 1st of August, Austria's ally Germany declares war on Russia, and on the 3rd against Russia's ally France. On the 4th, Germany invades Belgium to attack France, and Britain issues the ultimatum, which is rejected, and declares war on Germany. Fairly sort of insignificant event on the 5th that most people focusing on the Western Front can gloss over very easily. The Ottoman Empire closes the Dardanelles to shipping on the 5th, and that's not dissimilar to what's happened with the current war in Ukraine. Throughout August, the Battle of Frontiers is fought, still a war of movement, and one in which the smaller British army excels through its skill at arms to the frustration of Germany, with the Kaiser labeling them a contemptible little army. In September and October, the race to the sea occurs. As October moves into November, the First Battle of Ypres is fought, and the race to the sea ends with both sides reaching the coast. The Allies had prevented German troops from reaching Calais and Dunkirk, and the Western Front soon shifts from a war of movement into a static war with stalemate of trench warfare. Despite many battles and little movements around the Battle of the Somme and Verdun, for example, the Western Front really remains in a fairly static position for the next few years. There are two unexpected events from the pre-war system of alliances, though. The first is that Italy, part of the Central Powers, refuses to join in the war with Germany and Austria, arguing that it was meant to be a defensive alliance only, and the Central Powers had shown themselves to be the aggressors. And secondly, on the 29th of October, the Ottoman Empire unexpectedly launches a series of surprise attacks against Russian Black Sea ports, including Odessa and Sebastopol. On the 11th of November, they formally declare war on the Allies. The Ottoman Empire had long been labelled the sick man of Europe, and were plodding a way back from a near century of political and geopolitical decline. In the 80 years prior to the First World War, its territories had more than halved, as independence movements and rival empires had claimed vast swathes of North Africa and much of its European territory. After the decline and setback of the 19th century, the Turkish leadership of the Ottoman Empire was in much need of reform. The Committee of Union and Progress, or CUP, established a second constitutional era in the Young Turk Revolution of 1908, which turned the Ottoman Empire into a constitutional monarchy. It conducted competitive multi-party elections, but the disastrous Balkan Wars and the now radicalized and nationalistic CUP took over the government in a 1913 coup d'etat, which created a one-party regime focused around the new Sultan, Mehmed V. He was really a powerless figurehead, though, and the three pashas, Enver Pasha, who was commander-in-chief of the Ottoman army and minister of war, Talat Pasha, who's the Grand Vizier and Minister of the Interior, and Ahmed Jamal Pasha, Minister of the Navy, who will meet again shortly when we get to the Sinai and Palestine campaign. The new leadership was initially hostile to Germany because they'd supported the government of Abdul Hamid, and worse, supported Austria-Hungary's annexation of Bosnia in 1908. So the CUP sought British help to secure its remaining territories, but Britain instead proposed that the Ottoman Empire become neutral and accept financial subservience. Despite the Ottoman Empire having aligned with Britain and France in the Crimean War against Russia, the new leadership subsequently began to turn to Germany, who were increasingly supportive of Ottoman finance, trade, railroads, and military advice, in fact. Indeed, Liman von Sanders had arrived in 1913 to help modernize the Ottoman army. And 3 months before having publicly declared war, they'd already agreed a secret alliance with Germany in August of 1914. Germany's interests, obviously, were not wholly altruistic. Britain had been modernizing its naval fleet, and Germany had been following suit in a sort of never-ending naval arms race. And it needed oil too. A Berlin to Baghdad railway was first proposed in 1903 and was intended to stretch 1,600 kilometers, or about 1,000 miles, across Central Europe, then on to Turkey, Syria, and Mesopotamia. Not only would this provide easier access to Middle Eastern oil, but also provide a direct connection to a Persian Gulf port. Germany, fresh with the memory of how effectively rapid rail transport had aided its victory in the Franco-Prussian War, wished to gain such a link for any possible future use to transport troops into a closer proximity of British India. Germany also coveted the Suez Canal, which would have provided much easier access to its East African and Pacific colonies, plus the added advantage of being able to move naval assets into the Indian Ocean and beyond. This, of course, caused fairly grave concern in Britain. Maurice Jastrow wrote, "It was felt in England that if, as Napoleon is said to have remarked, Antwerp in the hands of a great continental power was a pistol levelled at the English coast, and Baghdad in the Persian Gulf in the hands of Germany would be a 42-centimetre gun pointed at India." And the Deutsche Bank had already been receiving fairly significant public investment through shares issued and financed Philip Holzman's construction work, which had first begun more than a decade before the war even started. But the reality on the ground was quite different. By the start of the war, both geographical and political obstacles had prevented the completion of the Baghdad Railway before the war even started. In fact, less than 50% of the route had been constructed. And existing internal railways within the Ottoman Empire were of a fairly significantly inferior quality. Much improvement was needed for the type of railway that Germany was thinking of. And in reality, the rail connection between Europe through Constantinople or Istanbul into Basra wouldn't be completed until 1940. The Suez Canal was of vital importance, as was the neutral or aligned, or as was the Ottoman Empire being neutral or aligned. Britain's most important regional concern, however, was actually oil. Towards the end of the 19th century, the Royal Navy had begun switching from coal-powered fleet to an oil-powered one. At first, it sprayed oil onto low-quality but abundant Indian coal to make it burn hotter, but then moved to oil-driven engines. In 1908, the English geologist George Reynolds had discovered abundant oil reserves in Persia. And in 1909, a public stock offering saw the creation of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which would provide much of the fuel for such ships. So it became vital to Britain that no other power could threaten that oil supply. And in fact, the 6th Indian Poona Division were the first British Empire troops deployed into the Middle East in early November 1914 at the Foul Landing, ostensibly to protect the oil fields of southwestern Persia. The Mesopotamia and Caucasus campaigns were covered in more detail in one of my other lectures, so I won't go too much further into that. So the Ottoman entry into the war. So it was that they not only declared war on the Allies on the 11th of November, but Sultan Mehmed, speaking in his role as the Caliph, declared it a holy jihad, hoping that millions of Muslims across the British, French, and to an extent Russian empires would rise up in support of their faith and cause internal conflicts to split those empires. German agents had also been working to support seditious uprising, but few would really eventuate. One example, though, was the 1915 Singapore Mutiny, where 850 British Muslim sepoys did mutiny. That lasted for about a week and resulted in the death of several officers and soldiers, including Malay officers and 14 British civilians, plus some Chinese civilians as well. But the British force in the area was really too strong, as well as naval detachments, and more than 200 sepoys were court-martialed, with I think about 45 being publicly executed. The declaration did not go perfectly smoothly either. An internal conspiracy to undermine Germany and the CUP resulted in many of the CUP leaders being shot. The German military mission in Adrianople was attacked on the 12th of November, and on the 13th, a bomb exploded in Enver Pasha's palace, which killed 5 German officers, but failed to kill Pasha himself. Anti-German committees were formed across the country to try and rid the empire of those who sided with Germany, and there were mutinies in both the army and navy. But despite the internal disruption and minor mutinies, military power remained in the hands of Enver Pasha, Minister for War. And these are the 3 Islamic leaders that Germany had hoped would really be the cornerstone upon this Islamic militantism. The Ottoman Minister of War, Enver Pasha, as we've just discussed, the Shah of Persia, and the Emir of Afghanistan. Sultan Mehmed's call to jihad against the Entente in the fall of 1914 largely went unheeded across the Islamic world. In reality, it inspired very few to the battlefield. However, many thousands of Senussi under the command of Ahmed Sharif el-Senussi, who was aided by Bedouin allies, did try and force the British out of Egypt. They gave the British Empire forces an opportunity to try out some of their new technology, such as aircraft and armored cars, which would become key weapons in the coming Middle Eastern campaign. The uprising occurred across large swathes of North Africa, including the Western Desert, which of course British forces would again fight in some 25 years later. And it lasted from November of 1915 to February 1917. An unwelcome distraction really for British High Command, but under William Peyton, the uprising was eventually put down. The Ottoman Empire wasn't really in a great geographical position to be trying to wage war against two of the world's most powerful empires, the Russians bordering them on the north and Britain on the southwest. And despite 3 months of pretense at neutrality, the internal transport and communications were not really sufficiently modernized for a modern military campaign. And it took the Ottoman forces 35 days to march to Erzurum, from where they were to launch their attacks against the Russian border. So the Russians were given plenty of time to prepare for that. 4 main campaigns developed around the Ottoman Empire: the Caucasus against Russia, which cost the Ottoman Empire over 100,000 casualties; the Persian campaign against Russia, Britain, and Persia, which, although militarily indecisive, cost over 2 million civilian deaths; the Mesopotamia campaign up through the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which actually began badly for Britain with the siege of Kut, but eventually became an unwelcome division of resources for the Ottomans; and the focus of today's talk, Egypt, Sinai, and Palestine. The British seized the initiative in Mesopotamia, having captured Basra in November of 1914, but Jamal Pasha had been ordered to create an army to directly threaten the Suez Canal, pictured here at their famous muster on the plains of Esdraelon. The Fourth Army under Jamal Pasha's command, but alongside him was Friedrich von Kressenstein as Chief of Staff, a very experienced German officer. The Bikana Camel Corps were the first to intercept the invaders as they arrived in Sinai in a skirmish on the 20th of November, which cost the Cameliers more than 50% of their men. In late January of 1915, the Ottoman army attacked the Suez Canal with a 20,000 strong force. But an organized defense had been established under General John Maxwell, consisting of a series of posts with trenches and sandbag revetments and protected by barbed wire entanglements. The British at this time had assembled some 70,000 men in Egypt, mostly British Indian Army divisions, together with the 42nd East Lancashire Division, local formations, and the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. 30,000 of these men were dedicated to these defences. The Ottoman army was led by Kressenstein's 8th Corps, 5 infantry divisions, the 8th, 10th, 23rd, 25th, and 27th, including Sinai Bedouins, Druzes, Kurds, Mojahirs, Circassians from Syria, and Arabs. As the Ottoman force moved into position, their scouts observed British troops playing football, and so believed their location had gone unnoticed, but they were wrong. The main attack fell against the centre sector on the 2nd of February, with many of the attackers actually successfully crossing the canal using pontoons. But by the morning of the 3rd of February, the attack was checked by defending British troops and the gunnery of British and French ships moored in the canal. A strong counterattack from the 92nd Punjabis drove the Ottomans back across the canal, and their attack petered out. A full withdrawal was effected. The army mostly withdrew to Beersheba in Palestine or Kacha, with Indian troops, including the Lucknow Brigade, having played a key role in defending the line. Although the majority of the Fourth Army withdrew, advanced troops and outposts were maintained throughout the Sinai Peninsula on a line from El Arish to Nekhel, with force concentrations at Gaza and Beersheba. Any thoughts of immediate pursuit were checked when, in early March, Maxwell was asked to prepare a force of some 30,000 Australian and New Zealanders for operations in the Dardanelles with the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force. They would be formed together as the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, or ANZAC. This was a strategy Winston Churchill had proposed to try and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war quickly by opening up a second front in the Dardanelles to link up with the Russians in Eastern Europe and be able to attack Germany from the direction of the Balkans. It was to involve a naval attack through the Dardanelles to capture Constantinople, the Ottoman capital. The naval phase lasted from February to March, but despite severe pounding, the ancient Dardanelles fortresses held out, and worse, several British and French ships were sunk by mines. So a land campaign was proposed to capture Constantinople overland under the command of Sir Ian Hamilton. He had 78,000 strong Mediterranean Expeditionary Force, and on the 25th of April, 1915, they invaded the Gallipoli Peninsula at 3 locations. His force consisted of British, Indian, and Newfoundland troops, the Anzacs, and the French Orient Expeditionary Corps. But the campaign failed in all of its objectives and lasted 8 long months, costing 250,000 casualties. By January of 1916, the Allies had successfully withdrawn from the Gallipoli Peninsula, with the campaign being considered an Ottoman victory. And they hadn't remained idle in Palestine either, extending the lines of communication towards Egypt and furthering the railway to Beersheba by some 100 miles or 160 kilometers. As the Gallipoli campaign petered out, authorization was given to move British defences 10 kilometers forward of the canal. The main British HQ was at Port Said, but an advanced HQ was now created at Kantara, and 3 defensive sectors were created. Number 1, Southern, which covered the Suez to Kubrit HQ Suez, with 9 corps responsible. Number 2, Central, Kubrit to Ferdan HQ Ismailia, under 1 Anzac Corps. And number 3, Northern, Ferdan to Port Said, under 15 Corps. Force in Egypt was reorganized under Sir Archibald Murray's command on the 10th of March 1916 as the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, now with orders to pursue the retreating Ottoman army that had been attacking the canal. The British staff believed a more forward defence would be better than static defences waiting for the Ottomans to launch another attack. But the Sinai Peninsula in which these operations took place is a pretty hostile desert environment where reliable water supply can be the difference between life and death. 2 main problems were present. The Ottomans still had their water supply of cisterns and wells for their forward positions, and the British didn't have one. So to support their forward advance, work began on a railway to assist the forward movement of troops and supplies. The existing single line of rail to Romani was doubled, and a pipeline was laid to pump water from the Sweetwater or drinkable water canal of Ismailia to forward positions. It would eventually follow the British forces on their way to Gaza. Disrupting Ottoman water supply was as vital as creating their own pipeline. So on the 14th of April, the Bikana Camel Corps, with Australian Light Horse units and engineers accompanying, conducted a raid on a well boring plant, water wells, and pumping equipment at Jif Jaffa, capturing an Austrian officer and 25 Ottoman soldiers and 15 labourers in the process. Murray was still concerned that Katia could be used to stage another attack on the canal, though. So on the 23rd of April, a force of 1,500 men, including 2nd Light Horse Brigade, New Zealand Mounted Rifles, Warwickshire Yeomanry, Royal Gloucestershire Hussars, and the Queen's Own Worcestershire Hussars, were sent to Katia to drive the Ottoman line back. However, an Ottoman attack against them was much stronger than expected, and they suffered over 500 casualties. So force in Egypt was reorganized as the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, and many of the experienced Gallipoli veterans now began to return to fill up its numbers. It had HQs at Suez and Ismailia, and it was initially led by Lieutenant General Philip Chetwode. But perhaps one of the most effective decisions of the new EEF was the grouping together of mounted elements into a new formation known as the Desert Column, consisting of the 42nd East Lancashire Division, the 52nd Lowland Division, the Anzac Mounted Division, the Australian Mounted Division, the Imperial Camel Brigade, and the British Yeomanry Division. The Desert Column would become one of the which becomes the Desert Mounted Corps from mid-1917, was the Egyptian Expeditionary Force's primary offensive tool, really. And consisted of cameleers and horsemen. The mobility of these mounted men would be really crucial to success in the Middle East. Major elements included the Anzac Mounted Division under Major General Harry Chauvel, consisting of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Australian Light Horse Brigades and the New Zealand Mounted Rifles Brigade. Now, the Australian Light Horse famously rode the Whaler horse, which was bred from a variety of breeds, including Thoroughbred, Arab, Cape Horse, Timor Pony, and a little Clydesdale or Percheron. But its secret ingredient was the touch of Brumby, wild horses that roamed feral in Australia since the mid-19th century. and they were very famous for being hardy and temperature tolerant, which were ideal for this campaign. There was also the East Lancashire Division, Lancs Fusiliers Brigade, East Lancs Brigade, and Manchester Brigade, the Lowland Division, South Scottish Brigade, Scottish Rifles Brigade, and Highland Light Infantry Brigade, and the 5th Mounted Brigade, including Royal Gloucestershire Hussars, Warwickshire Yeomanry, and Worcestershire Yeomanry. Indian Cavalry, including the Jodhpur, Mysore, and Hyderabad Lancers. The Imperial Camel Corps and various support units, including elements from Field, Horse, and Garrison Artillery, the Hong Kong and Singapore Mountain Artillery, the Australian Flying Corps No. 1 Squadron, and the Royal Flying Corps No. 14 Squadron. And another key element of the War of the Middle East was the creation of the Arab Bureau in January 1916. It was originally intended to harmonize the political activities in the Middle East of the Foreign Office, India Office, Committee of Defense, War Office, Admiralty, and Government of India. But it became a highly effective intelligence gathering organization, and it drew upon many pre-war regional experts and their existing networks of contacts. But as Bruce Weststrate wrote in his 1992 history of the Bureau, the agency subsequently bore much of the blame for Britain's terrible mishandling of Middle Eastern policy during and after the First World War. Whilst British forces continued to advance their forward positions, the Ottoman army had been preparing a counterattack, which came at the Battle of Romani, fought between the 3rd and the 5th of August, 1916. During the night of the 3rd to the 4th, the advancing force, including the German Pasha I formation and the Ottoman 3rd Infantry Division, launched an attack from Kutcha on Romani. Forward troops quickly began engaged with a screen established by the 1st Light Horse Brigade of the Anzac Mounted Division. During fierce fighting before dawn on the 4th, the Australian Light Horsemen were forced to slowly retire. At daylight, their line was reinforced by the 2nd Light Horse, and about mid-morning, the 5th Mounted Brigade and New Zealand Mounted Rifles joined in the battle. Together, these 4 brigades of the Anzac Mounted Division managed to contain and direct determined German and Ottoman forces and force them to stick into deep sand, where they came within the range of the strongly entrenched 52nd Lowland Division defending Romani and the railway. At daybreak on the 5th, the Scottish Rifles captured the high ground of Wellington Ridge, and infantry from the 42nd Division began to advance upon the Ottoman rearguard positions at Kutcha. The Ottoman force tried to maintain its forward position, but growing thirsty in the heat, was forced to retreat towards Ograntina. The 2-day battle for Romani and the Suez Canal had been won by British infantry and Australian, British, and New Zealand mounted troops, and it was the first large-scale mounted and infantry victory of the British Empire in the whole of the First World War. It came at a time when other allies were experiencing defeats or stalemate. They'd captured 4,000 German and Ottoman combatants and killed more than 1,200, but the main enemy force was able to escape with most of their artillery, except for one captured battery. Light horse patrols and effective long-range signalling had been important tools in effectively controlling the movement of the Ottoman and German forward positions. Allied losses were 202 killed, with 1,130 casualties, of whom 900 were from the Anzac Mounted Division. Von Kressenstein had prepared a successive line of defences during his advance towards Romani, and despite losing his one artillery battery, more than a third of his soldiers fought a series of effective rearguard actions which slowed the pursuit by the British Empire mounted troops, enabling his force to retreat back to El Arish. Von Kressenstein's force was now in full retreat though, and being harassed by mounted units of the Desert Column as they went. After Romani, the Ottoman survivors moved through Bir el Abd and then on to El Arish. Murray returned to Cairo and created Eastern Force under Major General Charles Dobell to carry on operations in the Sinai. The extraordinary work of the Egyptian Labour Corps to keep the railway and pipeline construction moving steadily forward behind the Allies as they moved forward kept progressing, ensuring their lines of communication were never overstretched. By December, it had progressed sufficiently to allow the next forward phase to commence. At the same time, desert patrols continually sought out and destroyed wells of use to the Ottoman troops, and by December 20, advanced patrols reached El Arish only to find it had been abandoned by the enemy. However, it was soon discovered that an Ottoman garrison was still stationed at El Magdaba, about 50 kilometers or 30 miles to the southeast. The Anzac Mounted Division covered the ground through an overnight ride, and the attack on Magdaba was launched at 6:30 a.m. by Australian, British, and New Zealand troops against well-entrenched Ottoman forces who were defending a series of 6 well-camouflaged redoubts. During the day's fierce fighting, the mounted infantry tactic of riding as close as possible to the front line and then dismounting to make bayonet charges supported by artillery and machine guns prevailed. They were also assisted by useful aircraft reconnaissance. All of the well-camouflaged redoubts were eventually located and captured, and the Ottoman defenders surrendered in the late afternoon. With the victory of Magdaba, the occupation of El Arish was secure. This was the first town captured on the Mediterranean, and infantry from the 52nd Lowland Division and 5th Mounted Yeomanry quickly began to fortify the town. The Royal Navy arrived on the 22nd of December, and supplies began being landed on the beach. After the arrival of the railway on the 4th of January, followed by the water pipeline, El Arish quickly developed into a major base for the EEF, and it was now also possible for aerial patrols to begin reconnoitering Ottoman positions in Gaza and Beersheba, which the latter of which was bombed as well. On the evening of the 8th of January, 1917, mounted units from the Desert Column, including the Anzac Mounted Division and the Imperial Camel Corps Brigade, as well as the 5th Mounted Yeomanry, No. 7 Light Car Patrol, and artillery, rode out of El Arish to attack the next day on the 9th of January. A 2,000 to 3,000 strong Ottoman army garrison at El Magharoutine, also known as Rafah, which sits on the modern border of Egypt and Israel. The British victory signaled the end of the Ottoman presence in the Sinai and the war moving into Palestine. With the victory at Rafah, Murray had successfully accomplished all of his and the War Office's objectives. He secured the Suez Canal and Egypt from any possibility of land attack, and his forces controlled the Sinai Peninsula with a series of strongly fortified positions in depth along a substantial line of communication based around the railway and pipeline, which stretched all the way from Kantara on the Suez Canal to Rafah. With the prospect of the war moving into Palestine, an agreement had to be made with the French, who had a strong interest in Syria, and the Sykes-Picot Agreement was secretly made at this time. But the war was still in the balance, and Gaza had been well fortified by Kristianstein and would eventually be very difficult to attack. In addition, Allied forces were now within range of enemy airfields, and German and Ottoman aircraft began raiding their positions with a particularly heavy bombardment of El Arish on the 19th of January. Mopping up operations continued to locate isolated Ottoman forces throughout the Sinai in February and March, as the plans were drawn up for assaulting Gaza. The Ottoman defenders had given up a small area of southern Palestine to reinforce Gaza, and the Desert Column's Anzac and newly formed Imperial Mounted Divisions quickly moved to occupy it. By the 26th of March, the 53rd Welsh Division, supported by a brigade from the 54th East Anglians, attacked the strong entrenchments to the south of the town, whilst applying heavy pressure there, whilst the Anzac Mounted Division and Imperial Mounted Division attacked from the north and northeast, with some of the Anzacs managing to enter the town. With further men from the Anzac Mounted Division joining the 53rd's attack in the afternoon, the southern defences began to fold. With most objectives captured, night stopped the attack, and word began to spread of large numbers of Ottoman reinforcements, so the withdrawal was ordered before the commanders were fully aware of the gains that they'd made. The Ottoman defenders had suffered 300 dead, 750 wounded, 600 missing, and German and Austrian losses were 16 dead or wounded and 41 missing. The British Empire casualties stood at 523 killed, 2,932 wounded, and 512 missing. It was far from a disaster, but Murray had prematurely cabled London to portray it as a victory, and the press jumped on it. With a naval offensive not succeeding on the Western Front, Russia struggling on the Eastern Front, and submarine warfare damaging morale at home, the War Office ordered him to press on to Jerusalem in the hope of a morale-boosting victory, and the order had been given before Gaza had even been secured. The First Battle of Gaza had been fought by mounted divisions during an encounter battle with speed and surprise on their side. The intervening weeks, though, Gaza saw Gaza substantially reinforced, and no surprise would benefit the next attack. Murray attacked with Eastern forces 3 infantry divisions supported by 2 mounted divisions. And this time the result was far from a close-run thing. Strongly defended entrenchments with enfiladed machine gun fire and supported by accurate artillery led to a disaster for Murray's forces, with some units sustaining 50% plus casualties. Here, for example, is a picture of War Baby, one of the tanks, a female Mark I tank, which were believed that were going to make a big difference in punching through the lines at Gaza. And as you can see from the pictures on the right, how badly destroyed it had been. Although the EEF infantry brigades had succeeded in entering the Ottoman trenches at several points, they were too weakened by the fierce defense to retain any gains during those strong counterattacks that the Ottomans launched back at them. And towards the end of the afternoon, it became apparent there was no prospect of success on any portion of the front. Offensive operations ended, with the Ottoman counterattack forcing them back. In total, 509 killed, 4,359 wounded, 1,534 missing. The Ottoman defenders had lost 400 killed and 1,300 wounded in what can only be described as a decisive Ottoman victory and a huge morale boost for the Ottomans' Fourth Army. Luckily for the British Empire forces, the Ottoman strategic priority had been Mesopotamia and Persia, and they didn't have reinforcements in place for a counterattack. From April until October of 1917, the Ottoman and British empires held the line of defense stretching from Gaza to Beersheba, and both sides spent the interval reorganizing. Life in the desert throughout the summer was unpleasant, camping in the open with food shortages, sandfly fever, lice and flies, and hot desert winds which would whip abrasive sand through the camp, burning skin and shredding canvas. Rations were noted for their lack of variety and poor quality. Rice, peas, dates, porridge, jam, bread, meat, and bread pudding were available, while sardines, pears, chocolate, sausages, milk, cafe au lait, cocoa, and biscuits could be bought from army canteens. However, during the operation, soldiers survived for long periods on iron rations of bully beef and army biscuit, only occasionally varied by cooking stews made with pressed beef and onions. For General Murray, the failure to take Gaza cost him his job, and he was recalled to England. The Ottoman forces created new army groups, Yildirim or Thunderbolt, to be commanded by the German General Erich von Falkenhayn. The EEF strength, once enough for an advance into Palestine, had been decimated by the 2 battles of Gaza. The 52nd Lowland, 53rd Welsh, and 54th East Anglian divisions, which had been reported to be about 1,500 below establishment before the first battle, had lost a further 10,000 casualties during those 2 battles. And 3 months later, they would still be over 5,000 infantry and 400 yeomanry below strength. This, at the time of the Battle of Passchendaele, or Third Ypres, was also demanding reinforcements for its high casualties. So the war is in the balance. Murray was replaced by Edmund the Bull Allenby. He was a wily commander who knew how to get the best out of colonial troops and was also skilled in the use of irregular warfare, having used colonial light horsemen to good effect in the Boer War. In command of Australian Light Horse was Harry Chauvel, a skilled cavalry commander who provided a perfect link between the British general and the sometimes unruly Australians. Allenby had created 2 separate headquarters, one stayed in Cairo to administer Egypt, while his battle headquarters were established near Khan Yunis. He reorganized his force into 2 infantry and 1 mounted corps, and by 28 October 1917, the ration strength of the EEF was 50,000, with a further 70,000 unattested Egyptians. But the German spring offensive in April 1918 meant several units were recalled to the Western Front, including many of the British yeomanry units. Rather than risk another headlong attack against Gaza, Allenby proposed a clever maneuver to break the deadlock. By organizing a long drive into the desert to capture the strategic wells and crossroad at Beersheba, Allenby risked potential disaster of the loss of many, if not all, of his horses. But the very unlikely nature of it meant Beersheba was less heavily defended than Gaza. Chetwood's 20 Corps with the Imperial Camel Corps Brigade attached and Chauvel's Desert Mounted Corps would make the main attack on Beersheba, while Bulfin's 21 Corps held the Gaza sector and the front line of the Mediterranean coast. The plan relied upon the mounted units and their ability to cross the open desert. In August, the Desert Column was reorganized as the Desert Mounted Corps, and Harry Chauvel made the new corps commander. Territorial horse artillery also accompanied them, and French cavalry would be added for later operations. And to substitute for the yeomanry units that had been recalled to France, they were added to by British Indian Army cavalry units that had been fighting in France. And in June and July, further mounted brigades began to arrive from Salonika. Allenby would be asking a lot of them in a dangerous, potentially suicidal, long-ranging ride across the desert. Australia's General Harry Chauvel was the ideal man for this job, though. He was not outspoken, had a calm, quick mind, and was intimately understanding of his men. There's a great quote by his biographer, A.J. Hill. He wrote no book, he had a contempt for showmanship, and as a field commander gave too little thought to what is now called public relations. It could have been said of him, as Kipling said of Lord Roberts, that he does not advertise. The plan also hinged on fooling the enemy that another attack would come at Gaza and not to send reinforcements to Beersheba. And it came in the form of Meinertzagen's haversack, which was conveniently lost in the desert, containing plans for the next attack on Gaza, which would never come. Although manpower was in short supply, opening the port at El Arish meant that Allenby did have the advantage of increasing numbers of modern equipment arriving there, including tanks, armored cars, which were particularly effective in a theatre where gaps could be exploited and long-range reconnaissance was important. Such armored mobility also allowed for rapid attacks on lightly defended or isolated units. Motorbikes, especially useful for long-range reconnaissance and dispatch riding, and aircraft, where although the Germans and Ottomans did have an aerial capability, British and Australian pilots frequently enjoyed aerial superiority. And of course, the latest high-tech communications, including mobile radio. So on the 24th of October, the Australians and New Zealanders moved out to secure further water supplies, whilst rear units moved up to occupy forward positions, ensuring it looked like usual work was continuing. On the 29th of October, the water supply at Azluj was reportedly capable of providing just 1 drink per day per horse for the whole division. By the 30th of October, there were 47,500 rifles in 20 Corps' 53rd Welsh Division, the 60th London Division, and the 74th Yeomanry Division, with 10th Irish Division and the 1st, 2nd County of London Yeomanry attached, and about 15,000 troopers in 2 divisions of the Desert Mounted Corps deployed for the attack on Beersheba. The deployment of the infantry divisions was completed by the light of a full moon, and Caterpillar tractors were used to bring up supplies and ammunition. The 2 mounted divisions of the Desert Mounted Corps had to ride between 25 and 35 miles, approximately 50 kilometers, to bring them within striking distance of Beersheba by dawn on the 31st. And they arrived late at night and only watered their transport horses to preserve vital water. A rough camp out in the open was hastily arranged in the dark, and many tired men were woken when the heavy artillery groups began their bombardment of the Ottoman defences at 5:55 a.m. Ottoman counter-battery fire soon began to fall atop the British infantry. Infantry from the 60th London, 74th Yeomanry, and 20 Corps from the southwest conducted limited attacks in the morning, and the Anzac Mounted Division launched a series of attacks against the strong defences which dominated the eastern side of Beersheba, resulting in their capture during the late afternoon. But the town itself had still not fallen as dusk threatened to approach, and Allenby was at Chetwode's 20th Corps headquarters at El Bogar when he sent the telegram to Chauvel ordering the capture of Beersheba before nightfall. So on the morning of the 31st, the Mounted Division had captured Tel El Salikadeh, about 10 kilometers north of Beersheba. The 1st Australian Light Horse and New Zealand Mounted Rifles then stormed and took the strategically located fortified position at Tel El Saba, in a fierce battle lasting several hours, clearing the way for the assault on the town, but their position was still over 3 miles from their target. Faced with heavy artillery and machine gun, an assault on foot would be suicidal. Remember, light horse, like mounted rifles, are mounted infantry. They usually go in by riding to their battle, dismounting and attacking on foot. But if the wells in Beersheba were not captured, the horses would perish soon afterwards. With the New Zealand mounted rifles successfully occupying the high ground of Tel El Saba to the north, a position between the Australian light horse and Beersheba lay open, but across a 3-mile wide plain. Chauvel called his commanders together for their views, and 4th Light Horse Brigadier Commander Grant suggested a charge would be possible. Girdwood, in command of the British 74th, demanded they undertake it as yeomanry, being better trained and more suited for a charge than mounted riflemen. But with the light fading and them being out of position, and perhaps aware of history closing upon him, Chauvel, and perhaps with a little patriotism in his voice, made his mind quickly with the simple words, "Put Grant at it." They would have one shot to avoid a potential campaign-losing disaster. The Australian horses had marched through the Negev desert for 3 days and had not been properly watered. In fading light at 4:30 p.m, with the units of the 20th British Infantry Corps and Yeomanry Division attacking Beersheba from the south and west, 800 bayonet-wielding horsemen of the 4th Australian Light Horse Brigade, made up of the 4th and 12th Light Horse Regiments, conducted one of the most extraordinary feats of the Middle Eastern War. Charging from the east across the 3-mile plain, which is roughly 3 times the length of the Melbourne Cup, over bare ground on a slight downward slope in the face of Ottoman artillery, machine gun and rifle fire. But the pace of their horses was such that the Ottoman guns could not keep up, and by 2,600 yards, they passed under the range of the artillery. The Ottoman defenders, with panic growing, reportedly forgot to wind in the range of their rifles and soon began shooting over the heads of the Australian horsemen. At 300 yards, their thundering hooves began to deafen, and some of the defenders began to break into retreat, abandoning their trench lines. The light horse soon were onto them, leaping the trenches and slashing with their bayonets. The battle joined, and the town would be soon overrun. But the strategic importance of those mounted troops of the Desert Mounted Corps was clear in the wide-ranging campaign, but of equal importance was the mobility of supporting units such as the Hong Kong and Singapore Mountain Battery. As the Australians advanced across the exposed plain, they came under heavy artillery and machine gun fire, and the HK&S batteries, as well as the Notts battery, opened fire in return, quickly silencing enemy artillery. At just past 2 miles galloped, it was the Essex battery's turn to come to their aid, putting down a machine gun crew which threatened destruction. There's a famous photo featured here, which is allegedly of the charge, long claimed to be of the actual day. But the position of the photographer is out in no man's land and in front of the charge, which makes it highly unlikely. As I mentioned, they did charge with bayonets, which are not an ideal weapon to use in a cavalry charge. But the success of their charge meant that soon afterwards, they were actually equipped with 1912 pattern cavalry swords, which they would go on to use in further campaigns. Beersheba was secured, and more importantly, several of the charges that were set to blow its wells failed to detonate, allowing for their capture. Engineers were set to repair the damaged wells, but for several days, many horses watered only on residual water that had left pooling on the ground from thunderstorms that had broken on the 25th. The 12th Light Horse handed over 37 officers and 63 other ranks as prisoner, and together with the 4th and 12th, they'd captured over 1,100 prisoners, 10 field guns, 4 machine guns, and huge quantities of stores. Total capture by the Desert Mounted Corps was over 1,500. The heaviest Allied losses were the British infantry of the 20 Corps, with 116 killed, and the 4th Light Horse suffered 35 killed and 39 wounded. 12th Light Horse, 20 killed and 19 wounded. Beginning on the 27th of October, the EEF began a heavy and continuous bombardment of Gaza. During this time, the 21 Corps, who'd been holding the Gaza section of the line, mostly passive over the night of the 1st and 2nd of November, began to launch attacks. The bombardment of Gaza intensified on the 6th of November, and on the night of the 6th and 7th, successful attacks were launched against several of the advanced trench systems. On the morning of 7th of November, Gaza was found to be evacuated. Ottoman morale had disintegrated and Gaza Gaza was occupied in the following days. The road to Jerusalem was opened, and the Desert Mountain Corps began pursuing the Ottoman army into the Judean hills. Further undermining the Ottoman strength, British intelligence was targeting Arab nationalism. I won't go into that as much today as in next week, but the Arab revolt had begun, and they played a key role, in particular in attacking the Hejaz Railway on several occasions under the partnership between Arab leadership and obviously famous Lawrence of Arabia. In November, the Anzac Mounted Division and Yeomanry Mounted Division began the drive up the Jerusalem Road. During the subsequent operations, about 50 miles of former Ottoman territory was captured, and the Battle of Mughal Ridge was fought between the 10th and 14th of November, with the 53rd Welsh Division advancing along the road to take Hebron and then Bethlehem, before securing the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. The Ottoman Third Corps had been ordered to establish defences around Jerusalem, and it held as the British forces approached. The Battle of Nebi Somoil from the 17th to 24th of November, and then the defence of Jerusalem from the 26th to 30th of December were fought, with Allenby's forces now had all the momentum, and Jerusalem fell to Chetwode's 20th Corps on the 8th of December. Lawrence's Arab army prevented the Ottoman forces from outflanking the main columns, and Jerusalem was fully occupied on the 11th of December, exactly 6 weeks after the capture of Beersheba. Out of respect for the city and to prevent its destruction, the Ottoman army withdrew from the Holy City, and Allenby humbly dismounted from his horse, entering the city on foot through the Jaffa Gate, together with his officers, proclaiming he had arrived as a liberator, not a conqueror. That's the end of the first part. I'll just draw your attention quickly to a book that I'm working on at the moment, Scholars, Soldiers and Spies, which looks at intelligence and espionage in the imperial age, including a lot of the work of the Arab Bureau, and All Things Being Good in the World will be out for sale next year. And also, just quickly, I've got a website launching. I'm doing freelance work now, which includes supporting research, writing, and public programming, including things like this event, and can also help with things like museum or collection management, outreach, public event support or education, etc. So either contact me directly or hopefully my website will be up soon. Next week will be the second part of this talk. I hope you've enjoyed the first parts, and we'll come back to meet the exciting conclusion, including the dramatic finale at the Battle of Megiddo, or Armageddon, as it was often called, for Allenby's checkmate, Jerusalem to victory, which is the end of the war in the Middle East. So thank you so much for your time. And hopefully there might be a few questions. So I'll hand back to Luke.
Thank you so much, Rob. Peter Newnham is just joining us. Hello, Peter.
Hi, hello. Thank you very much for that. That was excellent. Bit pacey, I thought. Difficult to keep up with, and there's a lot in there. But I noticed in one of your maps there was a faint depiction of some shipping off the coast of Gaza, and it prompted me to wonder whether in any of the battles for Gaza was there any Royal Naval gunnery support, and if so, how effective was it?
Yeah, there was. I'm less of a naval warfare expert, so I'm not going to try and remember names of ships or any of those sorts of things. But the Royal Navy did play a key role in this campaign, both in the defence of the Suez Canal. They had ships in the canal, and were vital for both troop movements and supplies. And once El Arish was captured, the Royal Navy began landing reinforcements and supplies into El Arish, and as I touched on, also where they could land heavy equipment like tanks or armored cars, they did so. There was naval bombardment of Gaza, but I'm afraid which ships and what degree that involved is outside of my army-oriented expertise, I'm afraid.
No worries, thank you.
Great, thanks for your question, Peter, as always. And I've got a question here from Bill Twist, who's asked me to ask you, can you elaborate a little bit on the role of aircraft, please?
Yeah, I touch on that a little bit more on in the talk next week, particularly at Megiddo. They're much more significant. They play a much more significant role in the battle once larger swathes of territory are occupied. I hope the maps that I chose were fairly indicative, but because of the nature of the Sinai Desert, the British, even though they did great work to consolidate their position with the railway and the pipeline and the fortified defensive lines and their defenses in depth, it was a very narrow corridor, and there weren't really any established airfields prior to the campaign. So it took them a while to be able to move air power forward. And the same thing applied to the Germans. They had air power based out of Gaza. And so when the two units sort of came together in that little corner of where Egypt and Palestine or modern day Israel meet, there was a little bit more in the way of air combat. But really they had to get El Arish set up and start moving air power forwards. As I say, in 1918, it becomes much more significant than it was in the campaigns of 16 and into early 17, though.
Great, thank you very much. A comment actually from Trevor Adams, who says, perhaps worth mentioning the film The Light Horseman, which is supposedly the best depiction on screen of a cavalry charge. But of course, they weren't cavalry.
40,000 Horsemen as well, a great earlier version of a similar story. And I might be wrong, but I've got a funny feeling that it either involved some of the veterans of the charge as extras or as advisors for the film. So that's quite an interesting little aspect. They weren't cavalry. You're quite correct. Australia only really had one proper cavalry unit, the New South Wales Lancers, who for the purpose of the war became light horse. Light horse, like mounted rifles, are mounted infantry. Their role was to ride to the battle, dismount and attack on foot as infantry. And it was literally just that circumstance of them being in the position, the 4th and the 12th regiments, to be able to charge across the open plain that led to Grant commanding that charge. It is referred to as a cavalry charge, and they certainly attacked on horseback, which is the role of cavalry, but they weren't trained cavalry. You could make the argument that once they started to be equipped with cavalry swords, they morphed into a sort of hybrid light horse / cavalry. And there were subsequent battles that we'll talk about next week, if you can make it back, where they do attack on horseback with swords in what can only be described as cavalry charges. There's a lot of mythology around it. In Australia, a lot of people falsely believe that it was the last great cavalry charge in history. It wasn't even the last charge that the Lloyd House undertook. It technically wasn't a cavalry charge, and it certainly wasn't the last cavalry charge of the war. There were other cavalry charges on the Eastern Front, for example, as well. But effectively, they sort of morph into a hybrid mounted rifles who can attack on foot with their rifles or bayonets, or mount cavalry charges from horseback with swords. So they do perform that role, but they're not really cavalry now.
Great, thank you. Julia Williams has asked if I can ask on her behalf. Do you have any information on action in late November 1917 that would have involved the 1st 4th Essex Regiment?
Oh, the way my talk has been designed has been at a much more sort of strategic formation level. I haven't gone into specific regiments in too much detail. If you want a bit of detail about that, what I would say is my email address is on the bottom of the screen there. If you don't mind sending a question to me as an email, I'll give you a bit more specific detail about that unit.
Great. Thank you very much. Philippa Kelly has asked, why did the UK, with massive coal reserves, make the decision to change their power to oil, which they didn't have?
Yeah, it's a good question. The simple reality is that the evolution of engine technology for naval vessels, oil-powered engines, more powerful, can create hotter burning combustion, which obviously can drive turbines or pistons or what have you with more force, and therefore the vessels are able to move faster. So it's effectively a question of engine manufacture and engineering, creating better, bigger, more powerful warships which can carry more armor, bigger guns, more weight, more crew. And this is a whole aspect of this huge, big dreadnought and then battleship sort of naval arms race that occurred between, in particular, Germany and Britain, but actually other navies were trying to keep up as well, the French and what have you too. So yeah, it's about the engine technology. You're quite right. It is, you know, sort of counterintuitive. And actually the Royal Navy, certainly the Navy fleets in the Indian Ocean and what have you, actually primarily relied on Indian coal rather than British coal, which was inferior and didn't burn as well as British coal for the most part, which is one of the reasons why when they first started exploring this technology, they kept using coal but sprayed it with oil to make it combust at a higher temperature and therefore burn hotter and drive engines faster. I suspect if you want a little bit more technical detail about that, you need to speak to a naval historian, and I hope I haven't got any of that wrong, because like I said, I'm not a Navy man, but that's how I understand it.
Thanks, Rob. Paul Cullum has asked me to ask you, how extensively were tanks used and how did they get them to the battlefields?
In this part, less so. They did start to arrive around this time, but come back next week and you'll see tanks feature much more prominently. They were moved around the battlefield with the British had these Caterpillar tractors. They were also obviously tried to be landed as close to operational theaters as they possibly could, or if necessary, driven under their own steam, which they weren't particularly fast. So that's not the best way to get it to a forward position. But they do feature in part 2 of this talk a little bit more prominently in the early phases, certainly from sort of, from 1914 up to 17, it's much more about horsepower and camel power than mechanized power. But we do already see in 1915, for example, that Senussi campaign I was referring to, armored cars play a pretty significant role, more so than tanks, but the armored cars are actually pretty prominent, and staff cars are used and what have you as well. But tanks really start to, well, yeah, Battle of Megiddo next week. Come back and you'll see the tanks playing a part.
Great. Finally, it's a question or a comment from Linda Wedderburn, who said, I believe many of the Australians took the horses with them, sometimes horses they had bred and trained themselves, and then weren't all the horses destroyed? The men must have been heartbroken. Yeah.
Yeah, that's also quite a personal story for me, I guess, and it is upsetting. So one of the reasons I have a particular interest in this theatre is my great uncle was a remount for the Australian Light Horse. He was a horse lover, and before and after the war, he trained racehorses. We have a particular, I don't think it's that popular in Britain, but certainly not as popular as flat or jump racing, but we have a particular type of buggy racing using little single seater 2-wheel carts, which are very popular in Australia, and he used to particularly love training horses for buggy racing. And I still remember as a young man, he was still alive in the early 1980s, and I still remember as a young man going and visiting his house, and he had a stable in the back of the house, and kept horses there. And I remember meeting and feeding his horses very, very clearly. And I do remember his uniform and a few souvenirs and things on the walls. Certainly a lot of horse ribbons from horse racing and that sort of thing. And of course, the remount's role was to train horses and ensure that there were replacements for any horses killed in battle or sick or injured or what have you. So that was something that he did during the war. And I was too young and I never spoke to him personally, but I think the impression that he was heartbroken by that fact. They did have personal relationships, many of them, if they were lucky to go through the war without their horse being wounded. Many men had the same horse, and obviously in a situation like warfare, you form a very strong bond with that horse. And because of Australian quarantine law, none of those horses were permitted to return to Australia. And the British High Command were very concerned about an Arab army or any local forces receiving the 50,000 plus horses that were present, or 60,000 something plus horses when you add all the British and Indian horses in that were in theatre. Them going to create cavalry units for an Arab army or some such thing caused a fair amount of concern. So regrettably, all of those horses were destroyed, and it was the role of the remount men. I think a lot of men did take it upon themselves to euthanize their own horses, but I think a lot of it was done by the remount men, and I can only imagine that was something that my great uncle was quite upset by.
Absolutely. I have a final question just coming from Susan Vincent, who asked, could we see, or could she see the slide of the 3 leaders Germany relied on, and how supportive and helpful in reality was the Shah of Persia?
The Persians were, even stretching back into the days of the Great Game in the mid-19th century, were sort of between a rock and a hard place, between British India and the Russian Empire to the north. And for a period, essentially, even though it was never properly occupied as a colony or a protectorate, it was more or less divided into a Russian sphere of influence and a British sphere of influence. And when the Persian campaign was fought, the Persians fought basically against everyone, against the Russians and British and against the Ottomans, and I think were more or less in a position where they were much more concerned about trying to rid themselves of foreign influence of any sort than necessarily supporting the Ottoman Holy War. The fact that Ottoman and Persian forces clashed with each other goes to show they clearly were not aligned. And I don't think we've got really time here to explore in detail the sort of nature of Shia and Sunni Islam and its divisions, but obviously not all of the Islamic forces within the Ottoman Empire and adjacent to it were aligned in religious doctrine, let alone political ideology or intended outcomes at the end of the war. So yeah.
Great. Rob, thank you so much for fascinating talk this evening. I'd just like to remind everybody that's tuning in that part 2 of this, or the second half of the history, if you like, Allenby's Checkmate, Jerusalem to Victory in the Middle East in 1918, Rob will be presenting next week at 8 o'clock. And if you haven't registered for that already, please do register on the website. But for this evening, just remains for me to say, Rob, thank you so much for sharing that talk with us. And we'll see you back next week.
Yeah, my pleasure. I hope everyone enjoyed it, and I hope as many of you as possible come back. It really is the dramatic conclusion, and so it's definitely worth tuning in for.
Right. Thank you so much. And for everybody else, good night. Thank you.
Mademoiselle.